This week, we're going to introduce and discuss three of the most popular, I would say, teaching methods we see at the college level. And this is lecturing, discussion, and groups. So we're going to start with lecturing for student learning. The specific objectives for this video lecture are for you to be able to identify when lectures are an effective teaching method, to explain potential drawbacks of using this approach as a teaching method, to describe strategies we can be using to prepare and deliver an effective lecture that helps support student engagement and understanding. And finally, I want you to propose an active learning technique you could incorporate to create an interactive lecture. So if you've read this chapter in the book, you know that it recognized lecture has been around for a long time. It's a very low-tech approach to teaching. It's essentially having someone who knows something stand in front and deliver what they know to an audience. It does, even though it's been around for centuries, it still remains one of the most utilized teaching strategies. And they can be effective. So sometimes lectures get a bad reputation, and there's definitely things we can do to make a lecture more engaging and effective. But we use them because they work. But they work even better when we can incorporate active learning activities. So they do lose some effectiveness if this is all you do, or if you don't lecture very well. So I want you to reflect on your own college experience, and as you are considering a course you may teach, when might lecture work? When is that the approach you need to use? And what are those situations where a lecture really is going to be your best option? I'm sure you can think of a few times and a few classes you've been where that was the primary delivery technique. And in the book, on page 177, it lists several reasons why lectures are still being utilized as widely as they are. Sometimes we need to use them when we need to convey certain facts and knowledge quickly to students. We may just want them to know how to do some things so that we can move them in to the next stage of the class, or into a lab, or into some sort of other activity where they need to understand the basics before they can move on. They work well when you have someone who's passionate and dynamic and interested in the material and shares that enthusiasm. They work when it could be dangerous to provide information. You need to tell people what the dangers are in a chemistry lab. You don't need them to find out on their own, so lectures are important for that. There's some other approaches you can see about modeling problem solving or higher order thinking before you hand that on to the students. If you don't have another way to share the information, sometimes in my discipline of agricultural communications, I have to put together different materials and resources, and it's easier for me to just explain that in class versus having students read or watch a lot of different videos that may be too simple or too complex. You can also reorder how you're going to present information and convey that to your students. The book goes on to say maybe you need to add your viewpoint on the subject matter, or this one, bring in another person to provide their perspective. You may want to use it as an interest approach, or to give just a little bit, you need to get a lot of information in a short amount of time, or you want it to introduce them, or you need them to review it, such as a flipped classroom approach before they do an activity. So there are many reasons why you would want to use a lecture, and they do work in these circumstances. But if you sat through a college class or have the responsibility of teaching one, you know that it's difficult to keep students' attention. Studies have found that students are fairly attentive for 15 minutes. That's one of the reasons I tried to keep my video lectures to 15 minutes or less. The program I use cuts me off at 15 minutes, which is a great reminder. But studies have also found that if you can add an active learning strategy into a course, it could boost the attention and level of performance. So one way to approach this is just to think about breaking a longer lecture into a series of mini lessons and build in these opportunities for students to re-engage. And you'll see that you may never get back to the full level you were at the beginning, but it helps. This study was often cited. My video recording cut off the reference, but I'll have it in my PowerPoint notes. This is from a Time magazine article about this study that found that our human attention span is declining. We went from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds in 2013, which is less than the average attention span of a goldfish. So as teachers, we have to work hard to keep our students' attention. One of the other considerations is, what role does having the notes play in that attention process? So this is an individual question that you would need to answer as an instructor. So should you provide lecture notes at all? And then if you decide to provide them, are you going to share them before or after the lecture? And there are definitely benefits and drawbacks to each approach. Personally, I in my undergraduate class rarely provide the notes unless I have lots of examples embedded in. So when we're working on writing, I might have examples of good and bad writing, or I might have examples of leads or headlines. And so I'll provide that to students after the fact so that they can use it as a reference. You've probably taken courses where they provide them ahead of time so you can take additional notes as you go, or even classes where they'll remove certain words or phrases so that you have to fill in the blanks. And again, it's a matter of your philosophy and what you find to help your students the most. Sometimes I just feel like if I provide all of the answers up front, they zone out. They don't feel like they need to take any additional notes. I've already given them what they need, and that's not what I want my students to be doing. So as you are creating an effective lecture, there's some things to keep in mind. And we've recognized and tried to reinforce that you need to consider what are those student learning outcomes. What is it that you want your students to be able to do, to explain, to demonstrate by the end of that period of time? And really consider, can lecture alone achieve that outcome? Once you've decided, okay, what do they need to know, then you can step back and start to plan your lecture. You should really limit your lecture recording to one major topic because students struggle to remember where something left off and where you started again. But we'll talk about outlining, and there's ways to help them recall that information and then to see where you're headed. As we noted, to keep engagement and attention spans, you need to try to divide that major topic into 15 or 20-minute chunks, and then build in some active learning strategies to re-engage your students, and then provide a recap at the end. You should, at the end, watch the clock and don't go, oh, we're out of time, see you next week. But instead you should say, here are the most important things we talked about, we did, that you learned today. And that really helps reinforce the lecture. So for the lecture outline, you would start with an introduction and you would explain how the lecture relates to course outcomes. I tried to just explicitly list what are the learning outcomes for this lecture, this video, this activity. You should try to review and transition from previous course material. This helps students be able to connect that information they're about to get to what they already know. It might also help students who are gone recognize what they missed and how this is building on that. You'll need to hopefully grab their interest somehow with some sort of attention grabber. And I mentioned providing those learning outcomes very explicitly. Then you break into the body section and consider how you could divide it into those smaller mini lectures. You should provide an organizational outline, helping students see clear headings and navigation, just helping them see like, okay, we're moving to this point and to this point. And I use PowerPoint for my lecture slides. Some professors don't use slides at all, but they might use transition words or phrases to help students know we're moving on. When possible, integrate visuals, examples, and restatements. And then finally, at the very end, you should leave 2 to 3 minutes so that you can summarize the important points, perhaps ask if students have any questions, or phrase it as, what questions do you have? And you could even incorporate a recap activity or a quiz, something like a quiz if time permits. Sometimes we'll see the muddiest point. Professors will have students write down what was one thing that was really clear and what was one of the muddy points, and then they use that when they're preparing the next lecture. So you've probably sat through enough lectures in your educational career to recognize some hallmarks of effective delivery. And the book identifies many of these. And these are the things that when you go in to observe another teacher, you're usually going to notice. So there are strategies to work on these. And again, the book provides some more explanation and examples, but there's a lot that is wrapped up into this one slide. And it does take practice right here. You have to practice and get some feedback about how to work on these skills over time. So I mentioned earlier the idea of the interactive lecture, and just want to bring this back up. I found this study that shows that, as students' attention starts to wane, this study found that by incorporating an engaging activity, they were able to boost students' attention. Not 100%, but it helped. So this is, again, another example of how incorporating an active learning strategy can help students engage with the material throughout the lecture period. The book highlights several of these specific active learning strategies, and I've listed them here along with the page numbers because this will be part of the discussion post for this week. So there's a variety of things that you could have them do individually or as a group effort. You also could get some pretty easy ways to engage students in the lecture by surveying their responses. I use show of hands a lot. You can use online voting like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter. Some universities pay for clickers in large classes. So the book talked about using colored note cards so that students could just show a note card that correlated with their response. There's lots of options here that helps keep them engaged throughout the lecture. There's also some details in the book that we just don't have time to get into in this lecture about helping your students take notes. This is especially important in a freshman or sophomore level course where students are still trying to develop those skills. So as I mentioned for this week, I would like you to review those active learning strategies in more detail and consider which one might be something you could use in conjunction with a lecture in a college level course you would like to teach. So in review, a well-crafted lecture engages students and should provide active learning opportunities. Lectures can be a more passive environment, and we have to work to maintain engagement. A strong lecture ensures clarity, organization, and alignment with learning outcomes. And if you can divide it into many lectures, it will help students stay engaged. You should also be practicing your presentation skills and finding ways to integrate those active learning strategies.